So the topic for today is, I dubbed it ending relationships, but we're not going to be talking about actually ending romantic or partner relationships, but about those times when staff leave us, voluntary or otherwise. So also talking about firing staff, also about when contracts end. So obviously if we engage a subcontractor or someone to do work for us, that naturally has an ending. And also when customers leave. So think of those contexts as we go through everything. There is a big focus on particularly employees and contractors leaving, but I do encourage you to think about even when board members leave or advisors leave or an investor leaves. So happy to touch on those as well. I might ask first. So Leanne, you were saying just before that this is a topic that you identify as something that you find difficult. What do you want to hear about in this session? What's something that you want to gain an insight into or get better at or want to talk about?
Well, I want to be able to, sometimes you've got a working relationship with someone that you don't want to keep. You're doing a project with them and you know it's getting nowhere, but you still value the knowledge that they give you and being with them. Is just if you don't want to work on one of these projects, and what happens often, you get on projects that you know is going to go nowhere, it's taking a lot of time, and then when you have to say, I don't want to do it anymore, it then ends up being that you lose contact with that person, which you don't want to do. And I think that's I'm always only contracting people. I don't have any staff. So when you've got someone that you've had working, and you don't want to pursue that contract. Oh, I've had this contract, I don't want to keep doing it. How can you do it in a way that's gracious and kind, but also kind to yourself? You don't end up hanging on to something. Like I've hung on to something for so long that in the end it rips people apart. So I'd like to do it when I know I should do it and do it well, and especially and also when customers are leaving, how to do that as well.
Yeah. So there's three things that I picked up in there. So I'm just going to write these notes to make sure I cover them. But that first one you mentioned, you don't want to lose maybe the person or their value. It's just that maybe that could be the context of their current role, but also recognizing that I think we make a mistake sometimes when we think about terminating someone, like the end, that it's final and absolute, as distinct from making sure that we're open to the idea that one day they might have a role to play again in the future. And I know someone that left a startup. They were part of the founding team of a startup here in Brisbane, and they left, and 3 years later they came back into a senior role. So I think always being open to that. Then the second thing you said around the timing. So we do have a tendency to hold on too long, even though we know in our gut that it's not working out, or it's not the right fit, or they're just not delivering the value. So that's definitely something we'll talk about. And the third one there, when a customer leaves, and having a process around that. So they're three awesome ones. What about you, Nikki? Anything that you want to cover today?
Yeah, so I did have a staff member who I had to fire earlier this year. One, from financial reasons for the business, because we weren't making enough business to cover her. And my issue with when I tried to fire her was, okay, look, I have to let you go. We don't have enough money. We haven't got enough clients to come through to. And to be honest, she was doing a shit job. So I was having to do all the work that she was doing. I was having to redo everything. So she was costing me money because I was paying for everything twice. I was paying for myself and for her. So when I let her go, I was like, we can't afford to keep you. And she was like, oh, okay. And she was crying and doing the thing. And then the next day she came back and she's like, cool. So what work have you got for me? And I'm like, no, I fired you. And she's like, oh, yeah, cool. And the next day, she came back 3 days in a row. Hey, so what work have you got for me? No, mate, I don't have any work for you. I fired you. So, yep. And I had an example of a client, same as well. I had to let go of a client who was being very difficult. And that I found that really difficult too, because it's really like I'm really emotional in that space, you know, because you think that you've done something wrong, but really it's actually in that instance it was the client. And so I guess the first thing is, how do you do it tactfully that they actually understand that they've been fired, and secondly, how do you do it without breaking yourself apart? Let these people go.
Yeah, that second point is a particularly good one, and I didn't actually have a slide in there to speak to that, but we definitely need to speak to it. So I'm going to put it down as self-recovery.
Awesome.
But yeah, that first one about the Klingon, the staff member that doesn't want to leave after they've been fired. I mean, we also, you know, this can be a really traumatic experience for someone, and particularly if someone's living, you know, paycheck to paycheck and being fired has a significant, not just financial, but life impact on them. There can be that real struggle for them to actually accept reality. And you know, think of the process of grieving. For many, being terminated is a grieving process that they have to go through. And part of that is denial. So, yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying there. We can talk about some of those aspects as well. That's really good. So, oh, sorry, we've got one more joiners I should have looked up. Let's have a look. Welcome. How are you? Sorry, I don't know your name, but Move and Play Pediatric Therapy. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Emily Hales.
Hey, Emily. Nice to have you along. My name's Aaron. We're just kicking off, so we're just literally talking about what we hear about today, so hence the big ear. But just curious to hear, Emily, is there anything in particular that you'd like to hear during this session today?
Not particularly, I guess, just what would be our due diligence for, I suppose, managing people. Yep.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and for context, so I said at the start that today we'll be talking about definitely, you know, the context of firing people, but also just when contracts naturally end. So when we're subcontracting and contracts come to an end. Also when a customer leaves, so when our relationship with customers comes to an end. But I'd encourage you to also think about, you know, board members, investors, basically any sort of work relationship that comes to an end as we go through the content. So what we'll do now, we'll kick off. This session is being recorded. So if you do, you know, as much as possible, I want you to have free flow of conversation. So if there is something that you want to talk about where you'd like me to pause the recording, I'm absolutely comfortable doing that. So if you want to talk about a specific staff member or a specific issue that you had, you're not comfortable with that being in a recording that Split Spaces will put on YouTube, more than happy to pause the recording. So just flag that at any time as well. One thing I want to note at the start is, you know, this whole topic of firing people, human resources, employment, contracts, there's a lot of legal consequences around this, and there's a lot of law around it. I am not a lawyer. I am not giving legal advice, despite the fact that I did study law and worked in a law firm to the point just long enough to realize that I hated it and didn't want to do it. Nothing that I'm about to say is legal advice. This is just all from life experience as an entrepreneur and working with startup companies. So for anything, I really do encourage you to get legal advice when, particularly Emily's point there about the due diligence aspect of what we do. Really make sure that you are aware of the obligations under the law and that you get legal advice when you need it, or professional support when you need it, because we can't outsource responsibility for these things. So just make sure that you do, you know, go to that effort to understand pay rates, pay scales, awards. And the point about that as well is that these laws change very quickly. So there's like constant updates to employment regulations. So I really encourage you to get professional advice. So what I want to start talking about is when do we let someone go, or when do we face these issues? And this sort of touches on your questions, Leanne, about the timing. And there is that tendency to hold on too long. One thing I want to start by saying is, you know, particularly in the context of if we just talk about contracts for a moment. So often we hire someone on a contract to do a piece of work for us, and this could include, you know, when we outsource to a service provider, but also when we just hire someone on a contract. And what I'd encourage you to do is let people know as far in advance as possible, way before the end of the contract, your intent with renewing that contract. Often, people like certainty, and the absence of information, they make up their own reality. We call it the ... And the more certainty you can give to someone, the better they'll actually operate. And that includes even if you're going to terminate their contract. So I'll share a personal example. So I have a role at QUT, and during COVID, there was massive amount of uncertainty about staff contracts, and I'm on contract there. And here it is some 15 months later, and I still have no certainty over my contracts. I mean, I have a contract for this year, but it's never been indicated any certainty. So there's this real state of ambiguity. Versus Bond University, that as soon as COVID sort of started happening, they came out immediately and told anyone on a contract that their contract wouldn't be renewed. So immediately they have clarity, even if that's 12 months away for some, they could start working towards, what does that mean for them personally? And I just think some of the concepts I'll talk about here is clear is kind, but definitely have discussions with people very early in terms of contracts. The other part of this is when you do realize that it's time to let someone go, or that they're just not the right fit for your organization, it's better to start that process and conversation early. And we'll talk about the process in a moment, but start it. Often we delay because we want to avoid the hard conversation, or we have this hope that somehow it'll correct itself. I encourage you, take action to actually repair or terminate early. And part of that comes down to this mantra you may have heard, which is hire slow, fire fast. And this quote on the screen is from Tony Hsieh. Tony Hsieh was the founder of Zappos, a very successful company that Tony sold for, I can't remember how many billion, I think it was about 4 billion, but was known as having a phenomenal work culture. Like, people really wanted to work at Zappos. And part of that was the culture that Tony had built. And part of that was hire slow, fire fast. The logic there is hiring slow means that you take your time getting to know someone. In the investment world, when we're looking to invest in a company, we really take our time getting to know the founders. And that means not just in a work context, but even in a social context. So catching up with them over coffee or beers, because you get to see a different side of them. And in the recruitment process, you might want to consider things like bringing a staff member in to meet the entire team. I know some companies that operate where once someone goes through the formal interview process, they then come in and sit with the team for a day. And if any team member that they're going to be working with has a red flag, then it's an immediate no to hiring that person, because any red flag right at the early days is only going to manifest into a bigger problem. So hire slow and fire fast. And there's lots of reasons why we need to fire fast. And I'll talk to a couple of those points in this next bit. One thing that I'm a huge advocate of firing for immediately is any form of employee fraud. And by fraud, I mean quite broadly speaking in terms of dishonesty. Steve Baxter, who you might know from Shark Tank, was the chairman of one of the companies that I ran, and I just got to know him quite well. And he has a policy around any of the companies that he's involved with, in that if there's the smallest discrepancy financially, or if a founder lies about anything, he immediately withdraws from that company. So he won't invest, or he'll pull his investment out. And the reason being, it's a signal of dishonesty, and it's very hard to correct someone's values. So when there's a misalignment of values, it's almost impossible. I don't want to say impossible, but it's almost impossible to correct that behavior. So there's just a fundamental misalignment of values is a good reason to terminate someone reasonably quickly. Now, as I say terminate, we need to remember as well, we're not just talking employees, we're not just talking about contracts or contractors or subcontractors, we're also talking about customers. And in the session that I ran last month, talked about, we talked about governance, and we talked about a lot of the customer fraud that actually happens, where customers actually fraudulently, steal funds or resources or manipulate the business for their own advantage. So again, firing customers is something that you should also consider. And I've talked about this in different sessions where we've talked about customer segments and knowing which customers give you not only the best return, but also best aligned to attracting other customers, and also empower your team where, for example, you might have a certain customer segment that's very high level of support, and by firing that customer segment, it enables you to focus on another segment of the customer base or more customers because you have more time, for example. So again, don't just think employees when we talk about things like fraud and dishonesty. Another reason for firing fast is when someone, an individual, or perhaps multiple people add a toxic nature or take away from your company culture. So if they just don't fit on a cultural level with the team. And the challenge here is we've all seen workplaces where there's an individual who just doesn't fit the culture, and it ends up manifesting into poor behavior across the entire team. There's a company that I know that had two founders, and the two founders had quite different personality types. One was quite positive, the other one was a bit more negative. And what happened just over the space of, I think it was about 5 or 6 years as they were building the team, was they tended to recruit almost like two different types of people. One resonated with one founder and one resonated with the other. And there ended up being almost like these two subcultures in the startup. And it got to the point where it ended up in this us versus them toxic mentality in the team performance. And it came to a loggerhead between the two founders. And so one founder, the more negative founder, actually left the business. He was still, still had his shareholding, but actually left operationally. And what happened when that founder left, all of those individuals that were sort of aligned to that founder in that way of thinking actually all ended up leaving within the next 6 months. And as a result, the team ended up with one unifying culture and ended up performing much better. And there was much more harmony. They did regular surveys on, desirability of staying in the employment, desirability of the workplace, and all the stats went up. So sometimes we do need to think about even firing our co-founders, which is obviously complicated, and it's not as simple as firing them, but definitely something that we should talk about today. But the context of this slide is more to paint the picture of, it's not just always about performance. Sometimes we need to look at, as I said on the last slide, values, or in this context, cultural fit. And the reason for firing early on cultural fit is just because of the way it does manifest very fast. Then obviously we fire for poor performance. And as I've said in different sessions before, I'm a huge advocate of 360-degree performance reviews. And this is where every individual in the team, including yourself as the founder or as a team leader or manager, should get feedback from everyone around you. So not just your boss. Most organizations, we tend to do feedback on and appraisal performances by virtue of just responding to our immediate superior. But in this case, it should actually be getting feedback from subordinates, feedback from colleagues, feedback from customers, feedback from partners, vendors, suppliers, and also people above your immediate supervisor. Now, in that performance review process, when someone's not performing well, you need to actually let them know that. And this is something, we've talked about radical candor before in different sessions, but you need to be very good at giving feedback. And when someone isn't meeting your expectations, you need to be able to convey that, and you need to be able to give them corrective actions to take. So one mistake I see founders make a lot is they hire someone and they're not brilliant from day one. So what do? They fire them. And then they go and hire the next one. And then they go through this whole process. And they'll come to me complaining about, oh, geez, these millennials just don't, blah, 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 or it's so hard to find good talent, but they haven't actually invested the time into getting someone properly onboarded. So I know we're talking more about recruitment here and onboarding, but it's related to this topic, because if you're finding yourself with a high turnover organization, that's an issue. And as you grow, you should be measuring your staff turnover. I know a company here in Brisbane, very successful company. It turns over about 460 million a year. They're making about 60 million profit a year. And they have staff members that have been there for well over 12 years, many 15 to 17 years. Their staff retention is phenomenal. They very rarely lose a single employee. And everyone that's there wants to keep working there. As opposed to other organizations I know that just have rapid turnover, staff come in and leave very quickly. Now, those leaders of those companies with high staff turnover often make the mistake of blaming the staff or blaming the recruiters. They really need to look at themselves. They need to look a little bit inward at the leadership and the culture they've created. I'm a huge advocate of when you bring someone on board, you need to spend a lot of time with them, not just getting them up to speed with contextual knowledge, not just getting them up to speed with your procedures, your operating procedures, your processes, your policies, and not just getting them up to speed in terms of relationships with the rest of the team, but also giving them decision-making models. So what I mean by that is you spending time with them so that they understand how you make decisions, and even giving them a framework for how to make decisions. So Facebook are really big on this, for example. Facebook actually document models for decision-making for each team. And so you learn the model of how to make a decision. Think of it like a decision-making tree. And so for me, with Startup Catalyst, I had an employee who was a government staff member who was seconded to come and work for us under part of our government funding grant. And I spent a lot of time with her explaining how I think, so that then over time I could completely step away, give her full autonomy, and she knew how to operate in the business in alignment with what we were trying to achieve and in alignment with how I thought. That also requires you to spend a lot of time where you actually encourage them to think for themselves. So when a staff member comes to you and says, hey, how do I do this? Instead of answering it, because then all you do is train a monkey type response, encouraging them to think for themselves by saying, well, how do you think we should solve it? What do you think is the approach? And when they tell you an answer that you disagree with, you need to say, look, from my experience, I don't think that'll work, but have you thought about X, Y, Z? Or even better, let's go run the experiment and see how it goes. Because then by giving them the autonomy to suggest ideas and go and actually run with them and learn through the process, either successful or failure, they're going to actually learn for themselves. And when they learn for themselves, they have much better decision-making process going forward for what will work and what won't work. In other words, they find how to think. What I see a lot of leaders make the mistake of, they complain about their staff having no ideas or not suggesting things, or my staff aren't proactive. My staff never come to me with any ideas. They always wait to be told for things. Usually there's a pattern of behavior there where the leader, anytime an idea does come up, they immediately say, no, that won't work. Or it's leadership by authority, instead of backing the ideas, even if they think they're going to fail, giving them the autonomy to try. So my point on this slide is you need to have regular performance reviews with staff. You need to be giving constant feedback after every activity, after every event, after every deliverable. Have constant feedback so that everyone understands their performance, and they're also given an opportunity to improve and change. Because I see a lot of people being fired that were just never given the opportunity to correctly calibrate their performance or to upskill. Does that make sense for everyone? Does that resonate as well? Yep. The other side of this, though, is we often cling on to someone for so long trying to jam a square peg in a round hole, and it just ends up, it's not going to work. So as well as giving people the time and space to develop and the framework to develop, we also need to recognize when the fit just isn't right. And rather than sit there with a sledgehammer trying to make them fit, we do need to call it early and just recognize that it's not going to work. So we need to be really conscious of this. The only way we can identify this, though, is to be getting feedback. So to be hearing from the rest of the team, to be hearing from immediate managers, to be hearing from them as well. I'm a huge fan of every week having a 15 to 30 minute chat with each of your team members. Now, as your team grows, obviously you can't scale 15 to 20 minutes, but you would do that with your leadership, and then your leadership should do that with their subordinates. But ideally, you want to spend that time where you just go for a coffee or just have a phone call with each team member, and it's just purely a check-in. How are you going? What's happening at home? I talk a lot in the different workshops I've delivered about the importance of role and soul in the workplace. So not just people showing up to work and putting a mask on, but being their true authentic self. And you as a leader, you need to understand what your team members need in order to perform. And that requires that you get to know them personally. What's happening in their home life? How are they managing the shuffle of kids to and from school in addition to getting to the workplace, for example. And when you understand that, then you can better work with them. And your role is really a coach to get out of them their best performance. And having a regular catch up with team members will do two things. One is you'll get a better understanding of how to lead them and how to support them and help them to achieve their best. But second is it gives you a chance to give feedback where they're not going to be shocked when their performance isn't right. So the worst thing you can do is not give feedback and someone thinks they're doing a great job and then next thing they're fired and not being given that opportunity to improve. Which leads into this point that someone being fired should never come as a surprise. And definitely from a performance perspective, this makes a lot of sense, right? I don't think I'm saying anything here that you don't already know, but people should be given the opportunity to self-improve, to know where they're at, to understand the expectations being made of them. But the other part of this is, Mickey, to your point at the start, sometimes we have to let people go because of just purely the financial situation of the company. It's not a case of their performance is poor. It's just maybe the role has become redundant. So not they've become redundant, but the role has become redundant. Or we're not in a financial situation to continue to support people, the entire team. So we need to let people go. But in both those cases of redundancy or financial capability, that still shouldn't come as a surprise to staff members. And that requires transparency of leadership. And that requires transparency over things like our business financials. If you look at the highest performing teams, all the staff have complete transparency on the business. So often in startup land, we will have dashboards and screens all around the office that show our customer growth, they show the financials, they show our profitability, because we're one team. It's not a sense of, well, the management knows this and the boss knows this, but we don't talk about money as a team. If you actually look at the teams that have the highest trust, so mutual trust and respect, which are two key ingredients of performance, they actually have transparency over things like their financials. And so when you're coming into a time of hardship, actually sharing with your team, we're fucked. Like, we are strapped for cash. It's going to be super tight. We're not sure how we're going to make payroll next month. Now, I've got this wrong. So during the GFC, we had a team of 6 plus myself and my wife at the time were running the business. And I remember we were having the team Christmas party and the staff were going around the table talking about, what they were all up to in their personal lives. And one was just planning a big holiday. One was buying a house. And I can't remember the other one. There was another story of someone, making some other financial commitment. And my wife and I were sitting at opposite ends of the table, just looking at each other. We knew we had less than $5,000 in the bank account. And we didn't know how we were going to make payroll that week, let alone, carry them over the Christmas period. And we ended up having to go $150,000 into personal debt to make payroll for a couple of months until we could turn things around. And we didn't let the team know that. And in hindsight, after working with so many founders who did the opposite to me, what they've shared is that by sharing those moments with the team, it galvanizes the team. It really bonds the team. And the individuals who might feel, threatened or disheartened and end up leaving because they need that financial security, it actually makes the team stronger by those that are left behind. And a good friend of mine, Joe, he did this with his business. He openly said to his team that he and his wife were going to take no salary and that they would look after all their staff. And their staff actually came back and volunteered to earn half wages in order to make the company more likely to succeed, because that's how much they believed in what they were doing and believed in the team and wanted to support each other. So through these moments, they're actually really team galvanizing moments, and allowing people to make a choice for self over those that want to leave in that situation or those who need the financial security.
No, I'm letting out how to fire stuff.
Sorry, I think Mickey's
No,
unmuted herself.
Yeah, that's the rest. That's me 4 straight.
Sorry, I just muted her. Yeah, so firing someone should never come as a surprise, even when it is about redundancy or about financial capability of the business. Now, the other thing here is we need to be conscious when we fire people, and this includes our customers and our suppliers and everyone else. Because when we fire someone, immediately the natural fear of everyone else in the team is, how secure is my place here? And we need to be really careful about how we fire people in terms of whether we are maintaining a psychological safe space or we're creating a psychological unsafe space. So what I mean by that is you want your employees to always feel safe in their workplace. And psychological safety means where we're comfortable admitting mistakes, we're comfortable talking about failures, we're comfortable being ourselves, like being our authentic true self and saying what we really believe. And that ultimately leads into the highest performing teams, but also the most innovative teams, the best problem solving teams, and their happiest workplaces. When we have an unsafe psychological space, people are afraid of admitting mistakes. So they're more likely to hide mistakes. They're more likely to commit fraud or be dishonest. They're more likely to have bickering because people aren't comfortable saying what they really think. So instead we have the water cooler conversations. There's more cases of people talking behind people's backs. There's more gossip. There's more slander. There's also less sharing of ideas out of fear of being judged. And so when we have a psychological unsafe space, we have a lower performing team and a lower performing business. Now, it's really important that we get, the firing process correct, or the end of contract, end of relationship process correct, so that we maintain a psychological safe space. And if I could just share one way of doing that, is to communicate. Like, you cannot communicate too much in this sort of context when someone's being let go, or when you're losing a customer or losing a key partner or an investor pulls out. You need to communicate as much as possible with your team, openly, honestly, transparently, so that everyone understands. Another key part of that is to be consistent. So if you run a restaurant and you fire Mary because she was late to 3 shifts, and yet John has been late to every single shift since he started and doesn't get fired, then that is a really unsafe psychological space. It shows bias. It shows that there's no clear, consistent formula or expectation of behaviour. It shows poor leadership, and it reduces trust and respect. So you need to be consistent. And one way to be consistent is to actually have policies, procedures, documented, that are publicly available, that everyone knows. And to be consistent in when you convey why someone is being let go or why a contract ended, making sure that it's clear why and that it's consistent. You stick to those same rules each time. So that's the end of that was all on when to let people go. The other elements there we didn't talk about were, in terms of an investor, for example. So I'll just touch on that quickly. But sometimes we actually do need to fire an investor. So I know a couple of founders who've talked about this. They get an investor into their business. That investor helps them grow to a certain point. But then at that point, it's almost like they've outgrown the investor. And what I mean by that isn't just that they stop putting money into the business. When we go for investment, as I've mentioned in previous workshops, you want to get an investor who delivers way more than just capital into your business. They should be delivering 10 times the value of their money in terms of knowledge, market, as in door opening, access to the market, credibility, and everything else. And as you grow, you'll find you need different capabilities. So sometimes we do actually have to fire our investors. We have to change our board members, because who we need as we grow is a different type of board member. Sometimes as well, the context of the when is also knowing when to fire yourself. So I know many founders who start a business, the business grows. Maybe one example is they start a business around a passion point. So they start a business. I know 3 guys actually in Mackay who started businesses in the agricultural machinery space because they love tinkering, they love the engineering, they love the R&D. But as they grow the business and they become international, they find themselves now managing 50 people, and they don't want to be a manager. They're like, this is the last thing I want to do. I want to be building machines and doing CAD drawings and designs. Like, I'm the mad scientist. And so they have to know when to fire themselves from the CEO role, put in a different CEO who has the knowledge and experience to grow beyond 50 employees. And then they can go over, for example, and head up the R&D unit and be the mad scientist, the tinkerer, the engineer. So sometimes a lot of this is firing ourselves. And the other context is, so we've talked about firing staff, ending contracts, firing investors, potentially firing board members, firing yourself. And the other one, as I mentioned before, is firing customers and knowing when you need to. So for us, with one of our software companies, we were targeting software for public internet access. So hotels were one of our customers. And originally we entered the market through small property owners who were like management right property owners. Just by virtue of that was what we had access to in the market. So on the Gold Coast, there's a lot of unit towers, apartment blocks that have typically like a retired couple who manage a holiday letting pool. And that was some of our original customer base. But over time, as we grew, we started to win contracts with Ridges and major international hotel chains, Hilton and others. And those clients, not only did they pay more, but they were much less work. They had in-house IT support. So they didn't need us to support them very much. Whereas the mum and dad operators of management right businesses had not only no in-house technical capability, but also often had limited technical knowledge themselves and were incredibly time poor. So over time, we actually had to fire that customer base so that we could focus on a different customer base. And that can sound horrible, but the mechanism for that was purely putting our prices up. It wasn't so much a conscious, we need to fire these people. It was more, we need to put the price up so that our profitability on our time, like return on time, actually makes sense for that customer segment. Any questions on the when before we move into this next section on systems?
Aaron, I was just going to say that putting your price up to fire customers, I think I've been doing that subconsciously to try and make sure that I can get rid of like the people that are going to take all my time and give me zero return. So I think that's exactly what I've been doing without actually saying that's what I've been doing. I'm like, oh, okay, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, firing the wrong clients, yeah.
And yeah, we had a separate workshop on pricing, but there's so much in it in terms of our branding and market positioning and how we're perceived by people. And I've shared before that I've got this totally wrong where I priced some software way too cheap, and the feedback from a big client that we were chasing was, even though our software was the best in the world at what it did, that was their words, we were an order of magnitude too cheap to deliver the service that they expected.
Yep.
And even though in our head we could deliver that service, the perception was that we couldn't based purely on our price. So yeah, often, Mickey, it's like we're firing customers that we don't even realize just by being too cheap, because they look at our product and go, oh, you're not the Rolls Royce version that I wanted. And when we put the price up, we actually attract those customers.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really good observation. Cool. So we're moving now to systems. And just to explain what I mean here is going back to that last point on we need consistency. In here, we're going to talk about mechanisms. And this is also partly to protect your butt, because when you do fire people, you need to protect yourself from any potential litigation or slander and your market reputation. So one thing before you go rush out and fire someone is making sure that you have the authority to fire someone. So we shared in the governance workshop last month on the difference in roles and responsibilities and legal roles between shareholders, directors, and management. So technically, as an employee of the company, and included in that, I mean the CEO, you don't just automatically get the right to fire someone. You actually need that right to be assigned to you by the board, and that's done through something called a delegation. And as I mentioned in the governance workshop, you should have it clearly defined in writing whether or not you have the authority to hire people and to fire people. And that authority might be to fire certain people, but not other people, or certain roles, but not other roles. Now, if you're just the founder of a company all on your own, and you don't have different board members or whatever else, this is sort of a point that you don't need to labor on too much, but I'd still encourage you to have something documented that's, when you wear your board hat, you've written something to authorize yourself as the CEO to say, you have authority to hire and fire people. the next part of this is having documented policies and procedures. And again, this can feel like an overkill when it's just, you or yourself and your hubby, or, just you and your co-founder running the business. But in terms of protecting your ass for, legally, both potentially in a criminal sense, but also in a civil litigation action, you need to have policies and procedures. So as simple as people knowing what is the termination period, what are the procedures for being terminated, what are the procedures when a contract ends, and these are procedures in terms of notification periods, these are procedures in terms of how these things are managed, these are procedures in terms of, if it is a performance thing, what is your performance review process, and how are performance reviews handled. Now, if you're in the practice of you just give staff feedback verbally after they've completed a task, the challenge with that is you don't have anything documented, so you've got no body of evidence, which leads into this next one, which is record keeping. You need to have good record keeping. And so if you are giving someone a performance review or feedback, you need to have that documented somewhere. Now, even if you catch up with someone, imagine you have a staff member do something for you, or a contractor deliver a piece of work for you, and it's not up to scratch, and you might just pick up the phone to the contractor and say, hey, that wasn't really what we're looking for, can you make these changes? What I'd encourage you to do is follow it up in writing on email, just to say, hey, Aaron, per our chat, wasn't really happy with that first draft. Here's what I need you to do. Could you please remedy this within, as we discussed, please have this remedied by Friday, for example. But having that in writing is really important, even when it's just that first thing, this person has been performing brilliantly. This is the first time there's an issue. The problem is you never know what other issues might come up in the future. So just document it. Equally, I'd encourage you to document the positive feedback too. So if people know your pattern is, geez, I get a phone call when I do anything good, and anything bad, I get an email. People know that you're doing this for record keeping, like that. You can start building up these little ... moments of what does this mean for my future employment. So even when something good, you give good feedback, also documenting that. Record keeping also includes when you hire someone, recording when they're hired, recording the process around them when they're hired. When you have to reprimand someone, having things for that, processes for that. Having record keeping around if there are any OH&S issues that happen in the workplace, and having definitely record keeping around the decision to fire someone or to terminate a contract or end a contract. So document it, document it, document it. If ever you do go for, into a civil case where you're being sued, the more documentation that you can show, that like really good record keeping, the more likely a judge will decide in your favor than if you just don't have the records, because it shows that you're a good corporate citizen. It shows you have good practices. So I can't emphasize enough, good policies and procedures, even if they're just basic, even if it's just half a page of dot points, having something is better than nothing. And you can get a lot of free templates online. One technique I use a lot is if there's a policy that I don't have, universities are really good at publishing their policies online for all of their staff and just for transparency. So finding someone or a similar business that's published their policies and just taking theirs and adapting it for yourself is a nice quick hack. There's also often templates that you can download from law firms. And then there's also services now where you can get a custom document made by a lawyer pretty cheap. And record keeping, really critical. The other part of this, before you fire someone, is making sure that you, number one, have employment contracts. So even when you hire your 14-year-old neighbor to do your logo for you, I encourage you just to have something in writing about, I'm paying you for this logo and an IP deed of assignment. At the end of this, I will own the IP. Because you need something that transfers the intellectual property. You can't just get the design. If you've paid for the design, technically you don't own the intellectual property. They've just given you a design. You've essentially licensed it from them. So it needs to actually be in writing that you own the IP around that design. So always have an agreement in place. And before you fire someone, reread the agreement to know what was in there in terms of notice period, what was in there in terms of all the requirements that you need in terms of ceasing their employment. I'm not going to dwell on this. These are 2 slides that I took from Fair Work Australia. And again, this is not legal advice. This is just sharing their slides. There's a lot of free content you can get from Fair Work Australia. But the other thing we should talk about today is when not to fire someone. The reasons you can't fire someone. So obviously, you need to be very conscious of discrimination, equal opportunity, equal treatment, and making sure that we're not in breach of any of those regulations. Some reasons that you can't fire someone that I see happen a lot, and this is a big no-no. So when someone's been sick and you just get pissed off at them and fire them because they've been sick, you can't actually do that under the law. This isn't so much an issue that I've seen recently, but if someone refuses to be a member of a trade union, or because they are a member of a trade union and therefore you fire them, you can read the rest of the list here. But these are all pretty obvious, but it is funny how they play out in our thinking. I know people that have openly said they don't want to hire women of a certain age because that's typically when they will fall pregnant and have kids. And that you just can't do that legally, but also it's not the best way of thinking, and you're missing out on an awesome potential employee. So I'm just reminding you that we need to be really cognizant of all the reasons why we can't lawfully terminate someone as well. Cool. Next, we're going to talk about the how. So this is probably the more fun bit that we came here for, which is, all right, this is all well and good. We've decided that this is going to happen, or someone has decided to leave us. So that's the other context too, is this isn't just us choosing to terminate someone. People choose to stop working with us. And so the question then becomes, how do we manage this? And you guys know I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. I love this quote from her, which is, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So when it comes time to let someone go, you need to be really bloody clear. So keep it short. Don't make up a whole waffly reason as to why. Don't feel like you've got to placate or make them feel better by giving a 30-page essay of why you're letting them go. Just be really clear. We've got to let you go. Performance wasn't what we expected, or whatever the situation is, and we'll be terminating you on this date. And keep it as short and simple, but give them a chance to also feel heard or to ask questions. But clear is kind. The worst thing you can do here is be disingenuous or not practice radical candor and say, oh, look, we're not going to renew the contract now, but we might in the future, and you've been amazing. Like, don't just be honest. Be honest, be honest, be honest, and be clear. Which does lead into Radical Candor by Kim Scott. If you haven't read Radical Candor, I really encourage you to. I know I've recommended it in a few of the workshops. It is all about how to give and receive feedback and how we converse with others. And the goal is to practice radical candor. And you can see some of the other models that people communicate with around manipulative insincerity, obnoxious aggression, and ruinous empathy. And the thing is, I see a lot of people, when they're firing someone, really fall into that bottom left quadrant where they say, they think that the employee is terrible, but that to their face they say, look, it was all good. It's just not, we just can't make it work right now. It doesn't give people a chance to grow and learn, but also if you behave like that in that environment, then chances are you're also leading and communicating that way to the rest of your team. And when the rest of your team knows that an employee just isn't up to par, they're not meeting the standard, and yet you make a comment like that, then every single employee will question every single thing that you say to them. It's a really ineffective form of leadership communication. And all it does is it create a really psychologically unsafe workplace. So you need to say and act in alignment with your belief. And you really need to practice radical candor. Now, in terms of how, so we're now at the point where we have to let someone go or let them know that the contract's ending. And again, this could be a supplier that you're no longer using. This could be an employee, a contractor, This could be a co-founder, investor, board member, whatever. One thing I encourage you to do is to use a third space. So a third space is typically, when we say a third space, we mean any place that isn't work or home. So coffee shop, park, beach, whatever. Now, the reason a third space is good is because there's a few things. So there was a company I know where anytime a person was being let go, the founder would always have a meeting in this one particular room, and that room became known as the firing squad room, because if you got called to a meeting with this particular person in that room, everyone knew that's it, it's game over, you're dead. And what a horrible way to put an energy into your workspace, right? So a third space, first of all, removes that. It can also make it a softer space to have a conversation. If the conversation gets heated, the rest of the team isn't there to hear it. It also creates a safe space where there's no one walking past the door, so people can be a bit more real. They're not being seen through a glass window where if there's tears, they're going to feel judged or feel insecure. They're given a chance to really have a safe space. Thanks, Mickey. I just saw your message there. Yep, you got a bail. That's all good. Yeah, so again, it's creating a psychological safe space that's not the workspace. If at the end of the meeting, that particular person needs to, they might need to go home, right? Like they're not in an emotional state to return to work, then they're not in the workplace where they've got to go back to their desk and their work colleagues and have tears running out of their eyes and everything else. You've created an environment in which you can respect their needs, take them out of the workplace where there's a soft space, it's a safe space. And again, keep in mind that you don't want this to also be a public place where they're going to see people they know. So don't use the third space, which is the coffee shop that the entire team goes to at 11:30, and you're there having this meeting at 11:30, and now they're surrounded by all their peers again. So use a third space somewhere out of the office is highly recommended. The other thing with this is it can be really hard for both you and them. And one of the early workshops we talked about body language and communication skills, and a few techniques here that can really help. So men in particular really struggle having deep or emotional conversations facing each other. This is why blokes go to the footy and all stare at something else, and we can have that great, deep and meaningful conversation over beer that we could never have when we're just looking at each other. So as simple as turning your body away so you're not directly facing them. So just shifting your body and pointing your body to a third anchoring point makes it a lot less confrontational. And so you can see in this picture, the guy on the right, he's doing body deflection. He's pivoted his body where he sort of can deflect any energy from the other person, and it's much easier for him to look away when he needs to. Very simple technique just to give you a bit more emotional confidence and safety in a conversation that's hard. As much as I say that blokes are great when we're communicating distracted by something else, I don't encourage you to take someone to the footy to fire them. Like that, don't confuse the two emotional states, but definitely using something simple like this body technique. The word of caution here, though, is not to come across insincere, where your body language is saying, I'm not talking to you, over something that's quite emotional and quite important. So you still need to be engaged, but just a little technique like deflection of your body can really help remove some of the energy from what is an intense conversation. I did have some other points on this one. I think just being cognizant of how they're responding emotionally as well, and not being, if they do start tearing up, just giving them that little space, like creating that safe space for them where you do turn away for moments, give them the chance to, not feel like they're being interrogated. So I think the construct of the environment, the construct of your body language is really important. Now, after you've told the individual, you do need to, and I'll talk more about what to say and how to say it, but you do also need to tell the team. So one challenge I have with one of the teams I work in at the moment is there's zero communication over new team members or people being fired and let go. And we're like the last to know. And it creates a horrible team environment where there's just no psychological safety. So you want to be really transparent with the team. You want to let them know that, XYZ is leaving, or we're terminating this contract with this supplier. And you want to do that in a way where they have a chance to understand why. So again, consistency, so that there's a chance for them to understand why. But also they might need their process of grieving as well. So they might have a deep relationship with this person. They might be best friends with this person. For them, it's a big issue in terms of maybe their go-to person and how they work in the workplace is about to completely change. So they need to also have their own process for grieving, potentially, for dealing with the change. So you really want to communicate as much as possible, give people a chance to come to terms with change and support them through it. Now, you can tell them as a team, but it's also worth having some one-on-one conversations as well, particularly with those that are like very close to the individual or to the people that have been let go. So, yeah, I wouldn't do it just as a team. I would do it as a team and then also to the individuals in the team. The other part of this is you should do an exit interview with the employee. And I'm saying employee here, but I totally believe this with customers as well. So when anyone leaves your company as a customer, investor, board member, employee, contractor, anything, you want to sit with them and understand why. So this isn't just if they choose to leave, but also if you choose for them to leave. You want to go through and understand their experience and get their insights into what you should be doing differently. Often it's the naysayers, it's the ones that don't like us, that give us the best perspectives and the best ideas. So sit with them and ask them questions. It's like, if they're choosing to leave, why are you choosing to leave? How did you find your time here? How could I have been a better leader? How could I have better supported you? What do you think we're doing wrong? What do you think we're doing well? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Give me performance reviews on everyone else on the team. Like, really give them get as much knowledge as possible. The second part of this is it's a cathartic release for them to be heard. So this is part of their grieving and change management process. You're helping them process this change by giving them an opportunity to feel heard. And that's really important, because when they leave, the last thing you want is for them to be a negative ambassador. You don't want them to be an adversary in the market that's hell-bent on destroying you, or that wants to go and write the review on Glassdoor about why you're a terrible place to work, or to tell all their friends about why don't ever get a job there. And again, part of this is, back to your point, Leanne, is, sometimes we want them to be back in the company in the future. It's not a hard no forever. It's just not now. And so by giving them this opportunity to feel heard and to value their opinion, you're creating that potential bridge to the future. The other part of this, I do encourage you to write it down, because often humans are very good at rewriting history in our brains. So what you'll get through this process might be very different to how that individual would talk about it 6 months later. Because in their own brain, they've had to justify all the reasons why they left, or it was you, not them, or whatever it was. So having it documented is really important. Now, some other stuff in terms of mechanics. So these are the bits that we often forget. You need the individual leaving to hand over their work in progress. So whatever they've been working on, that needs to be covered by someone else in the team. So unless the role has been completely made redundant, there's something this individual has been doing that the rest of the team is now going to have to pick up. So, and I mean this even if it's a supplier or an advisor. So getting them to hand over the work in progress, where is everything at? So they need to do a handover document, or they need to update a Trello board. They need to sit with, you need to decide who in the organization is taking that capability on, who's going to take that work on. Now, you might split that up across a team. So it might be like, hey, Marv, you're going to have to take this part of Mary's role. Lucy, you're going to have to do this part. And Sarah, can you be across this part? And they're going to have to spend time together to get that handover. And you want to do that as early as possible. So ideally, someone doing job sharing with that individual before they leave is a great way to do it. When I left Catalyst, they didn't actually advertise for my replacement as CEO, and instead they just wanted me to do a handover document. The problem with a handover document is you can't convey things in text. There's so much that you just can't convey in a document. So really, you want to have the successor to the role being able to work alongside in an ideal scenario. Unless that person is super toxic, where that's just going to be damaging, then you might have to manage it completely differently. So there are cases where you've just got to let someone go, terminate, and get them out the door day one, and just pay out their notice period. There's definitely cases where you're going to have to do that. But in an ideal world, you'd get their work in progress. Now, ideally, if you're a good team leader, you will already know what every staff member is working on all the time, because you should already have good systems and processes for workforce management, where you've got something like a group Asana, where you know what everyone is working on in the team at all times, where you have regular weekly or daily stand-ups where you know what everyone is working on at all times. But in the absence of that, you do need some sort of handover. The next part is documentation. And what I distinguish here between handover versus documentation is all the little notes, where are things kept? How do you do things? Maybe there's not a full procedure, but what are the little steps that Lucy was doing to manage this role? What was her thinking around social media posts? Whatever it was. But this could be as simple as something like a Word document. You could use Notion. I'm a huge fan of, so this particular screenshot here is actually a Notion page. It's a French written one, obviously. But Notion allows you to create very simple little web pages, sort of like a Word document, but all online. And you can actually use that for all your team procedures and notes. But getting them to document everything. If they're an engineer, as in a software engineer, getting them to put comments in the code base, like go and comment all the code base. Why when you wrote that function, what does it do? Why does it do it? What was you thinking? Comment, comment, comment. Document everything. You don't want them to walk out of the organization with any knowledge that hasn't been captured for the benefit of your organization. So between handover, documentation, then if they are doing source code, so anything relating to source code, make sure it's in something we call a repository. So a repository is just a fancy way of saying where the code is stored. And the thing about a repository, so these are tools that you can use. So the funny looking octopus cat is GitHub, there's GitLab, Bitbucket is one that I like to use because it's by Atlassian, which is an Aussie company. Any software developer will know what a Git or a repository is. Basically, they can commit their code into there, so you have all the source code. It's really important if you're letting a developer go that you have all of the source code. And included in that, I mean, if you've contracted someone to build your website, it's great that the website is live, but where's the source code? Because when you get the next person to work on the website, depending how it's written, they might not be able to make any changes without the source code. And that's definitely true if you have a mobile app. If you have any software that you're selling, you need the source code. So having an up-to-date repository is the best way to do that. And again, you want them to document that. You want them to hand over the access to that. I can't emphasize this one enough. Make sure you've got your source code. And then the second part of that is passwords. So often a staff member will leave and they've been using some system to do something and they didn't tell you the logons or the passwords, and you try and reset it and it gets sent to their old email account, and now you're locked out of the critical system. So get all the passwords handed over. Now, they probably will want to change those passwords to something more generic than their password that they also use for their personal banking or whatever else, but get all the passwords. Get them to actually just list down all the systems that they use and make sure it's all documented. And this can include email. So this is a bit of a touchy one in terms of, often workplace email also includes a lot of personal emails, but you may need them to hand over their email account to you, particularly if it's a sales role. So if you're letting someone go that was doing all of your BDM and they have all the relationships and all the email history that isn't captured somewhere else in a CRM system, then you might ask for their access to their email account. Now, let them know that you're doing that. If you're running Google, like G Suite, you can actually close their account and assign over all that into another account. But it's best if you let them know and give them a chance to purge anything personal. I had to do this. So with Startup Catalyst, when we got acquired and then I left the role, I had to hand over my inbox to the company. And I just made a point of deleting all of my personal emails. So I spent the better part of half a day just searching my inbox to remove all the personal emails and then just hand over everything else. It's something to consider. It's not always necessary. Like if it's an admin role or if they're an external contractor, not going to be as important. You might just ask them for copies of relevant emails instead of taking their email account, for example. Can you just forward me any relevant emails that pertain to blah, blah, blah. The other thing is then to close all their accounts. So it's funny, when I did leave one of those roles, how many accounts were left open. So even to the point that a year later, I could still log in and see all the financials of the company if I wanted to. I never bothered to. I could still access all sorts of systems, HR systems, which is quite ridiculous. So you want to make sure that all the accounts are closed when they leave. It sounds so logical. We all know it. We often forget to do it. But more likely what happens is we're actually not aware of all the systems that they have access to. Or, John in accounting shared his log on to some system and they still have those details and are logging in through that person's account. So really be conscious of who's left. And if they know, the other part of this is if you have systems that the entire team accesses with one password, for example, and they know the administrator password or the administrator logons, you need to go and change all of those. So an employee leaving or a contractor leaving is a good time to force everyone in the organization to change their passwords. So you don't have to say, I wouldn't do an all-staff email that says, hey, John left today, so we're all changing our passwords, because then the implication is John's not trustworthy. Instead, just do it on the Monday morning. Just go, hey, everyone, we're just doing a regular update of all our passwords. We're asking everyone to change every password in every system, for example. So, but don't paint it as so-and-so left, so they're horrible. Just use it as a simultaneous event, uncorrelated. Another one is getting them to return equipment. So if they're using a work phone, a work laptop, company car. I've heard cases of companies that actually forgot to take the company car back and people have kept them for years later. Like, I don't know how that happens, but obviously big companies, these details get lost. But more often than not, it's simple things, chargers, devices. I've seen companies that are really anal on this and go down to stationery and things like that. Totally up to you, but making sure all assets, you should actually have an asset register, and that could be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, right? But who has what equipment and making sure it gets returned. The other thing you should ask them to do is destroy any copies of any other information that they have. So either destroy or return, or both. So what I mean by that is employees will naturally have printed something at home at some point, or they've taken some files home, or maybe they've been using their own device and they have copies of documents and that sort of thing. Making sure that you ask them to destroy all other copies, ideally return them or destroy them. Now, you need to be careful. We don't mean destroy the original or destroy anything you don't have a copy of. This is copies that they have. So you're just asking them to clean their devices, remove anything. Many staff will take complete copies of their files when they leave because for whatever reason they want to use them in the future or they want to reference the work. You really need to make a point that, look, you can't take this information from the company. This is our proprietary information. You can also get them to sign a non-disclosure agreement where they don't talk about any of your IP with others in the future. But get them to return originals, destroy copies. And also making sure that you own all of the IP that they created. So this should have been in your original employment agreement. So every employment agreement should have an IP clause in there. Every contract with any vendor, supplier, graphic designer, web designer, developer, whatever it is, should have a clause about IP ownership. So anything you create during the course of your employment or while using one of our assets or while on employment time becomes the sole property of the business. Now, if for some reason you didn't already have that in place, then at the point of them leaving, you want them to sign something called an Ipd of Assignment. And again, you can download a template for this. They're typically 1 to 3 pages, but it's just to say everything that I created in the last 12 months during my employment with you is now your property. Now, some people, like if they're a graphic designer, they might really struggle with anything I created. So it might have to be a specific list, like this logo that I created, blah, you have complete intellectual property ownership of. So you can be really specific or be general. And ideally, as I said, ideally, this is already something that you have in place when you hire or engage them, rather than having to deal with it at the end when the relationship might have turned sour. It gets much more complicated at that point. So just a reminder, get these things in place early. And then one of the last ones that we often forget is handing over relationships. So, you know, it's very easy to think of, oh yeah, well, you've got this equipment you've got to give back. You've got this information, you've got this code base, you've got the passwords, but we forget about all the relationships that that person built. So often in a business, particularly if they're certain types of people, they have key relationships with stakeholders, they have key relationships with customers, and you need them to hand over that relationship. And what I mean by that is their contact information. So particularly if they've been in a sales role, you need to make sure you've got all the contact information of all the people that, not just your clients, but the people that, all the leads, the people that they've been selling to. You need to know not just the contact information, but all the other information in terms of, you know, I want to say intelligence on those relationships, who they are, what we know about them, when were they last contacted, and also hand over in terms of an introduction. So you want them to introduce you or whoever the new person is that's going to take on that relationship. Now, there's a couple of parts to this. One is so that you maintain these relationships, but also for those external people, you don't want them to feel disenfranchised from the company. So imagine you have a client, and Leanne, imagine one of your trainers, or one of your members who manages this customer base, and you get the handover. Like, you might know that the council has been dealing with them and you've got their details, but then that council rings up Mary and goes, "Hey Mary, I want to book you in again." And maybe Mary's number's been disconnected. Maybe Mary's like gone complete, don't deal with Leanne, like she's blah, blah, blah. Like, you need to reach out. So you need to let your clients know, your stakeholders know that, hey, I'm your new point of contact. You don't need to make mention of anything bad or anyone leaving. You can just say, I'm your new point of contact, get to know them. But you need to do that early. Much like informing the team, you need to inform others. Another key part of this is maybe even drafting the message that will go out to the market about someone leaving the company. So not so important for subcontractors or small roles, but if you have someone critical in the team that's leaving, you need to get that message out. So if a co-founder's leaving, that's definitely something that's going to be a red flag to the people out there. So getting on the front foot with the comms about what is our message and getting buy-in. So you need to do this process with the person that's leaving. So for example, when I left Catalyst, I sat down with the CEO of ACS and we talked about what's the messaging that we mutually agree to as to why I'm leaving, and making sure that that's a public statement that ACS would commit to saying and I would commit to saying. So have that conversation. How are we maintaining relationships for the company? How are we maintaining relationships for self? You need to be really respectful here. Like, you need to allow people to leave with their dignity intact as well. The next part of this is, if you have given equity to someone who's leaving, there's a question then over how you handle that. So we've talked in previous sessions about vesting. So this is where someone earns shares in the company over the period of time in which they work for the company. Now, you need to honor that. So if you've promised someone that every month they work in the company, they get 0.2% of the company for the first 4 years, then you need to honor that when they leave and actually give them those shares. If that's contractually obligated, if that was your word, commit to it. Now, sometimes though, we might want to buy out someone who's left. So what I mean by that is, if someone's left the company, let's say they own 20% of it, let's say it was a co-founder, You have the option of just leaving them on the cap table, let them sit there. They have their 20% holding. They've earned it over the last 4 years. It's all good. But you might also want to be completely done with that person and actually buy out their percentage. So you might get the company valued independently. You might get an accountant to do that. You might get an auditor to do that. You might get an investor to do that, or a mediator, and then actually buy them out just to clean up the cap table, to make future investment rounds much easier, where the investors aren't questioning, hang on, who's this person who owns 20% of your company that left under bad lever, might be, you know, disenfranchised, might be aggressive, might be adverse to decisions that are made in the future. So sometimes it makes sense to buy out the shareholding. Other times it makes sense to keep them on the cap table and keep them as a shareholder. Again, this is only a question when you do have someone leave that actually has equity in the company. And my last slide before we wrap up is just around allowing people to leave with dignity. I think this just speaks how you fire someone, how you let someone go, how you terminate a contract speaks so much about your own character. And affording someone just, you know, respect and dignity is a virtue. And how you handle that process will be seen by others. It'll be seen by the current team. It'll affect how safe your current team feels working with you and going forward. It'll reflect what people say about you in the market. It'll affect your reputation from a recruitment perspective, your ability to attract and retain talent. But also, I think it's just good. It's just good human practice, right? Like, let's just be good humans. So I think allowing people to live with dignity is a really, you know, advantageous, aspirational goal to have. And as with anything, I'm a huge fan of post-action reports, or also known as after-action reports, a concept taken from the military. So after you let someone go, do a bit of self-reflection. What did I do well? What did I do poorly? And what would I do differently next time? This is a great process to go through with anything you do, but particularly in letting people go. Like, what went wrong? How did we get this wrong? What in our recruitment process did we get wrong where we ended up having to fire this person 3 months later? You know, what did we do wrong in terms of our performance reviews? What did we do wrong in terms of our training, our upskilling? What did we get wrong in terms of our company culture? How did I fail to lead? How did I fail to bring out the best in this person? How did I fail to manage this relationship or to communicate? What could I have done better? Where did I let down? What skills do I need to invest in the team or myself? What will I do differently next time? Not just in the firing, but in the hiring, the management, the leading, and everything. So a really good process to go through with anything. And that's it in terms of the content. So I think at that point, we'll have a discussion. I'm just going to review the list of things we said at the start we'd like to talk about as well. Oh, that was one that came up, Mickey raised, was looking after ourselves through this process. So really important. A few ways this manifests that come to mind. One is preparing yourself before letting someone go. So if you're already in a very difficult place, or, you know, a highly emotional state of mind, or you know that, I mean, sometimes when we let people go, we're just really fucking pissed off, right? Like, it's just like, I've had this. My brothers and I had a restaurant, and there were particular staff members. Like, one we caught stealing from the till, and I was just ropeable. Like, I was not in a good place. And so knowing that that's not the best point in time to go and fire someone, you know, you need to have that awareness of, okay, I need to go for a walk around the block. I need to go for a run. I need to calm down and then come back when I'm in the right headspace to do this properly. Or I run the risk of this getting out of hand and becoming a situation. So knowing what you need coming into something is really important. And then knowing as well that afterwards, more than likely, you're going to feel pretty shit. Even when you nail it, even when it's amicable, you're going to feel something afterwards. So preparing in advance, like, I would not be firing someone on a day where then I have to back it into like sales meetings or you know, my kid's birthday or something like that. So scheduling things at the time that makes sense for you. Now, that could mean scheduling something for first thing in the day because you know otherwise it's going to hang over your head all day. Or for you, it might mean scheduling it for the last thing in the day because it means you can all go home and have a safe space. Yeah, or have a glass of wine. So knowing what you need, I don't prescribe alcohol as a solution, but knowing what you need is really important, and making sure you've pre-scheduled afterwards some sort of recovery mechanism is really important. So, going to the beach, going for a walk, exercising afterwards, avoiding anything where you ruminate. So this could include having a peer that you can chat to afterwards, being able to download. So we talked a lot, one of the early sessions, about download, which is just get everything out of your head. So even if it's just journaling, just picking up your phone and recording a video self-reflection to yourself about how you feel, just to get the words out. Contacting a friend and just saying, can I download? Which means don't give me any advice, don't say anything back. I just want to get all this shit out of my head and be able to park it in the universe, whatever it is for you. And knowing that, particularly if it's someone who's critical to the business, like a co-founder or something else, knowing that you might have a grieving process to go through around it as well. And you might need some time to heal, and investing in that healing process is really important. And there's lots of mechanisms for that. But also understanding what you want of that relationship going forward. So if it is a co-founder, how are you going to maintain, maybe they're a friend, how do you maintain that friendship going forward? Do you need a time where it's like, hey, for 3 weeks, let's just not talk to each other and then let's catch up for a beer? Or is it, hey, push through that and tomorrow let's catch up for a coffee before work? I know this has ended, but really want to stay mates. What is it for you and the nature of the relationship? But yeah, you do really need to be cognizant of what you need and how you operate best. Any thoughts, reflections, questions? Anything you disagree with, or personal things you want to talk about in terms of the content? Was that beneficial, Leanne?
Yeah. So it seems to me like when you start the relationship, getting all your ducks in a row first, so that then even with, because I get all rose-coloured glasses, and this is going to be the best thing we've ever done together, right? So I don't think about the possibility of having to have an exit plan. But if you kind of got all your ducks in a row, so that you even had that in, well, then you could do it. Like I've had a trainer work for me, and like I've got a message 15 minutes before class. Oh, I think you've really got this. You don't really need me.
Right.
And we had an agreement, right, that she would do a series of 10, and that we would work together, and that after 5 she'd work with me, and then I would leave her for the other 5 once everyone got to know her. So when it came to number 6, she just sent me that.
Yeah.
I think you've got this, and then left. But unfortunately, like, I enjoyed her company. She's a fun, wonderful woman that I enjoyed company, but you also lost the friendship in it because that was a ridiculous way of doing something. But I then didn't have a way of coming back. What was I going to say? I was like so personally hurt.
Yeah.
Because like 15 minutes before a class, which I wasn't supposed to go to because it was her time to do by herself. Yeah. She sends me this message, and then I'm like having to like split around, and I turn up at class, and then you've told a whole lot of 12 people you just spent a month and a bit telling them they're going to be fine without you. This new trainer is so wonderful and so lovely, and then she doesn't want to go. And I'm wondering whether a lot of it is like even that where you were saying performance reviews. So even like at week 2, I was like, she's not really stepping up here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I knew in my heart, but I didn't know what to do. So maybe it's like when you do the contracts, maybe I have to think more where we do sit down and review it. How are you feeling? And maybe at week 3, she would have said, this is not for me. I might have known.
Yeah. So there's a few good points in there. I think we often dismiss little signs and signals early, and we don't see them as red flags when they actually are. And so we need to be more aware of them, because something even small at the start of any relationship, I mean, this is true in like friendships and romantic relationships, those small little things at the start become these big things later. So I think you're calling them out early, like when you feel something in your gut or when you just notice a little thing, it is learning to call it out early. Like, hang on, I just want to pick up something you said then. You said this, just to be clear, like, here's how I react when you say that. Maybe it's as simple as that. It's not painting anything on them. It's just, here's my emotional reaction when you said that before. I just want to make sure we're on the same page, that sort of stuff. And correcting early, definitely. But trusting your gut in those moments. But you're right, like so much of this work is like front end. If we get it right, then it makes the back end easier. And partly that is expectation setting, partly that is procedures and other things, partly it's conversations, partly it's our recruitment, and the constant. I think the third thing you made me think of is the constant check-in, like just to sit, like maybe sitting with her once a week and just saying, how are you going? How are you finding it? Is this what you expected? Gives them a chance to say something where it doesn't just become a boiling point 15 minutes before they're due to perform. So yeah, it's definitely one where, like, for me, I find I love having teams, but it's so much work having teams.
Yeah, and I find like teams really hard, because like I want if they've done something. So if a report's been written, right, I looked at that, the cartoon thing that you're out there, and I am the person that will only pick what they did well.
Yeah.
Right, because what will happen is, like, they would have already told me that they had a bad day, their kid's been sick, they're this and this and this, and then I'm like, how can I say, well, the report, well, this is what you did well, but really it wasn't what I wanted, and I just now spent 5 hours doing something that I thought was going to be done. And the same thing that Mickey had been talking about, I find myself in that constantly, like even when and I'm thinking, well, maybe what's happening is that because I don't ever say anything that could be fixed rather than what's wrong, because I don't say it strong enough or in a way, when I do say something's not right, it shocks the crap out of them. That's why they run away. Because by then I'm probably, even I was thinking about my body language, when I get really, really stressed, I know that I ground my feet and put myself into a Tai Chi stance, which can be quite aggressive, right? Because that's the only way I know how to cope with my anxiety. So yeah, I'm just like thinking that next, I've got a contract finishing up. We're finishing really well. We're all happy, but the contract is finishing with another organisation, and my subcontractor's working it. And I'm just thinking, well, the process that I need to do now is that it's a month away, even though we've verbally talked about the fact that the contract's been finishing up. I need to send her an email that says this is finishing.
Yeah.
So that if I do go back into discussions with the actual organisation that I'm contracting to, there's not an assumption that she's part of that. If we take on something I know that it won't work with, so I'm understanding that, like, it's going to be finishing up. I had to do a debrief, and also that thing that you said about be careful with the relationship. So I've been staying away from face-to-face classes because she does a great job, but what's happening is I don't know any of the clients, and the reason I stayed away is because there's always comments about I do this class, and anyone else that comes along always feels they can't keep up to what I do and all that stuff. So I thought I'd stay away so that she was no longer in my shadow. But then what's happening is you lose contact.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I was trying to make it better for her, but maybe I need to have even written in the rules, hey, I'm going to be coming once a month.
Yeah.
So that there was that expectation. She'd know I was coming, so I'm not coming to check up on her. It's just what I do.
Yeah. There's so much in that bit, because I agree. You want to give your team members space to have ownership. I'm a huge advocate of giving them space to have ownership. But then I think it is in the framing. So it's like, hey, I'm going to come along every 3 weeks just purely so I know how to support you and to make sure that you feel like I'm here supporting you, and for me to learn from you. And, you know, those sort of little language techniques where, oh shit, you don't want it to be like, oh shit, the boss is here. I'm like, oh
yeah, no, I don't want that to happen. Yeah.
So it's a cultural thing, and it's part of your style, and you've got to build that rapport over time and that trust over time. But yeah, I agree. I think that is the challenge, is we give so much autonomy sometimes that we end up disconnected. And like we used to experience this, I would have staff who would go out and install with the client. So I'd be part of the sales process. I'd get the contract, but then the team would go and install and deliver. And they'd end up, that like the risk was I would sell one thing, but then what was delivered was completely different, and was realizing I need to go and do that check-in for the client and letting the team know, look, I'm not here to like, you know, watch over you. I'm here to make sure that the client is happy. And that's ultimately what we're all here for. So, but it took a lot of work to get that understood in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. Like, because I need to go and check the venue out and what's happening and how the setup is right. Because I said this is how I want it set up, but I've never checked whether it really is happening.
Yeah.
Right. And one of it was like, you needed to take a photo, and that's happened the last 2 months, but before that it didn't happen. So yeah, because I'm trying to give them that room to grow, because I can be, and I'm like, I tried to modify my style, and then I'm like, oh, I need to find this out. And like, yeah, we can get the new contract and everything will be fine, but I need to work it out so that when I take on more people, I've got a set process to do that they know, you know, like that so I could say that I need to come along because I need to feel the venue, because I'll need to do a report back to who we're contracting to and be able to discuss it. And I won't be able to discuss it if I don't go and feel what it feels like for you as an instructor. So go there to find out that I'm just trying to get what she tells me, the story physically, as well as what she's telling me or something, so I could figure out how to do it, which is what I should do as the person that's looking after it. But yeah, I think it's the ducks in a row thing, but also we never actually said we'll check up every month to check if the ducks are in a row.
Yeah.
And then another month goes, and because you get busy type of thing, another month. It's a bit like, I suppose, a bit like a rental property where you're supposed to go and check whether they've messed your house up and you're too scared to do it. Yeah. Yep. So I can see what you're getting at. So yeah, it was mostly because I wanted to know where to go to the end if I started putting new people on what I needed to do. So
yeah, I think part of it is in those situations, asking yourself, like reframing, I'm not a boss, I'm the coach. Mm-hmm. So what would a coach do in this situation? If I was coaching my employee to be the most amazing employee in this role, what would I do? And the second thing that comes to mind for me is when you having a team where it's not just the boss is here making sure I'm doing my job, but everyone is equal, making sure everyone is doing the job. So when you think of a team as a tribe, and one of the elements of a tribe, a high-performing tribe, is that everyone's there for a common goal, and whenever one person needs help, the entire tribe mobilizes, and everyone's accountable to each other. So that last piece, the accountability, means that this person should also be able to feel comfortable coming and giving you tips and advice on your role and what you're doing. So, and you can only start that by leading by example and asking them and inviting them to do that. So as much as you're going there to see what they're doing, inviting them into your space to not critique, but to help you in what you're doing, makes it that mutual trust and respect. Like that mutual aspect is really important.
Yeah, so we could sit down and like do a reflection on the last year and how, as a team, what things could we could change, and it could be, oh, you know, like this, and then it might point out.
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
Involving them in the decision-making process. So the leadership style that I believe is most effective is democratic decision-making. So in other words, get everyone involved in making the decision. So democratic decision-making, but authoritarian execution. So once a decision is made, it's going to fucking happen. And your job is to make everyone get it done.
Yep.
But I'll involve everyone in the decision-making process.
Yeah, not guided democracy. I used to work with someone who was a manager or something, and his philosophy was guided democracy. And I was like, okay.
Right.
Yeah. So he'd go to a meeting and he'd actually get exactly what he wanted, and everyone would think that they'd all had a say until like 2 weeks later, and then they realised they had no say. Yeah. But anyway, so it's like that discussion point and then making it happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's different if you're doing, if you're running a factory and you're just producing widgets on a production line. That's a very different style of leadership. But with what we're talking about, where you're in the early stages of a company, you need your staff to be thinking innovatively and contributing to innovative thinking. In that context, you want democratic decision making, authoritarian execution. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're the face of what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like they're the ones that are going out and doing it. So, you know, like it's got to the stage, like I'm trying to let them go out there because I can't manage going doing all the face-to-face. But yeah, I just haven't worked out how to make sure, not necessarily fire them, but just even be able to say, hey, I need changes. Where I can see that if I had that process that we got together once a month or whatever, because it's only once a week class, that would be, what can I do? All right, what do you need from me? What do I need from you? We could have had that conversation each time. Yep. So that, I can see that by having that as part of the process, not just making it casual, but like we still do, but casual. Maybe that's where my issue is that it's casual, that casual connection. And when we sit down and we're having a debrief, because I make it casual, it seems like two friends just having a cup of coffee, and I've got to.
Yeah, that is tough in that. I tend to build quite social relationships with my teams, but you need to maintain that understanding of roles and responsibilities. Yeah. So it's a fine art, that bit.
Yeah, and I think that if I had that paperwork in line that said, hey, so then we can go, all right, okay, we're catching up on this day at this time. This is for us being both in our roles.
Yes.
Let's get this over and done with. Oh, it's finished now. Let's go down and have a couple or whatever. So I can kind of see that if I had that process in place, then maybe I wouldn't have that, last bit.
I think so too. I think rituals are a really good way of embedding that.
And then I do have a question, but I don't need it recorded.
Okay. I can stop the recording. Hang on.